There was a fortune in the California hills, but not the one men died for. It was not the fist-sized nugget that stopped the heart, nor the brilliant yellow seam that drove men to madness in the dark. It was a quieter wealth, a substance of patient accumulation. It lived as a fine, dense dust, a metallic powder of incredible weight and value, hidden in plain sight within the one material every prospector cursed and shoveled aside, the worthless black sand. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from. And if stories of quiet genius and forgotten history fascinate you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's tale is even more unexpected. Gideon had once believed in the nuggets. He had believed in the raw, dumb luck of the pickaxe in the pan. He had come to the American River with a partner, Ezra, and a shared dream that burned as hot as their morning cookfire. They were not fools. They were hard-working men who knew the mechanics of a rocker box and the proper angle for a long tom. They chose their claim with care, a gravel bar where the river made a slow, inside bend, a place where gold, being heavy, should by all rights settle and wait. For months, they toiled under the oppressive California sun. Their days were a grueling rhythm of shovel and bucket, of pouring water and rocking the heavy cradle. The work broke their backs and split the skin on their hands. They found color, enough to keep the dream alive. Small flakes, tiny grains, a few respectable pickers. It was just enough to fuel the certainty that the big one, the legendary lunker, was waiting for them just a few feet deeper. It was a promise whispered by every glint in the pan. Ezra heard the whisper loudest. While Gideon remained methodical, calculating their dwindling supplies against their meager returns, Ezra grew frantic. Gold fever had taken him. His eyes had a hollow, haunted look, and he spoke only of the Motherlode, the one strike that would make them kings. He saw omens in the shape of clouds and heard fortunes predicted in the flow of the water. Gideon saw only dirt and rock and the unyielding laws of physics. The end of their partnership came not with a shout, but with a dull, wet crumble of earth. Ezra, convinced he'd seen the yellow gleam of a monster nugget deep in the wall of their diggings, had abandoned all caution. He'd been clawing at the unstable bank with his pick, ignoring Gideon's warnings about the rain-softened soil. Gideon was downstream, clearing the tailings from their rocker when he heard the sound. It was a low, guttural groan from the earth itself. He looked up just in time to see the entire section of the riverbank where Ezra was working slump downward. It did not collapse in a dramatic explosion of dust, but sagged like a tired beast, a wave of mud, rock, and tangled roots sliding into their workings. It buried their long tom. It crushed their rocker box into splintered pine. It filled the deep pit they had spent 2 months excavating with tons of sterile, worthless overburden. Ezra was thrown clear, landing in the shallows, but their tools, their labor, their entire investment was gone, buried. Ezra sat on the riverbank, caked in mud, and wept with a rage that frightened Gideon. He cursed the claim, the river, God, and finally, he cursed Gideon. "You were too slow," he spat, his face a mask of despair. "Always so slow, so careful. We should have had it. I saw it, Gideon. It was there." He left the next morning, joining a frantic party headed for a rumored strike on the Yuba, leaving Gideon alone with the ruin of their shared dream and a debt at the nearest supply camp that he had no hope of paying. For 3 days, Gideon did not move from the site. He sat on a smooth granite boulder and stared at the muddy scar on the landscape. He felt the grief, the sharp sting of betrayal, but beneath it, something else was taking root. It was not despair. It was a cold, clear anger. But it was not directed at Ezra or the river. It was aimed at the failure itself. He looked at the disaster not as a stroke of bad luck, but as a result, an outcome of a flawed process. On the 4th day, he stood up and walked to the one thing the landslide had not completely buried, their pile of tailings. This was the waste rock, the gravel and sand that had been washed through their rocker box, the worthless material they shoveled away to make room for the next load of pay dirt. Everyone had a tailings pile. They were monuments to futility, growing larger every day. He knelt and scooped a handful of the wet, dark sand. He let the lighter, silica-based sands wash away in the current of the river, just as he had done 1,000 times with his pan. He was left with a dense, heavy concentrate. It was mostly the black sand, the fine grains of magnetite and other heavy minerals that were the bane of every prospector's existence. It was notoriously difficult to separate from gold. Most men tried to wash it away as quickly as possible, accepting the loss of the fine gold that went with it. But Gideon stared into his palm. He looked closer. There, mixed in with the dull black and deep red grains of iron ore, were tiny, almost microscopic specks of brilliant yellow. It was gold. Flower gold, they called it, so fine it drifted in the water like pollen. Their rocker, with its crude wooden riffles and aggressive water flow, was designed to catch flakes in small nuggets. It was a net with holes too large. It was letting the smallest, and perhaps most abundant, gold wash right through with the other heavy materials. They had been throwing it away. Every day, every bucket, they had been discarding gold. They and every other man on that river were fixated on the idea of the nugget. They were hunters, looking for a rare and elusive beast. They ripped apart the earth, searching for that one dazzling prize, and in their frenzy, they were tossing aside a consistent, measurable harvest. The problem wasn't bad luck, it was a systemic flaw in their thinking. That was the epiphany. The great, blinding truth of it settled over Gideon with the weight of a physical blow. The Motherlode wasn't a vein of quartz laced with gold. It wasn't a single, massive nugget. The Motherlode was the dust. It was the accumulated wealth of millennia of erosion, ground down to a fine powder and scattered throughout the riverbed, concentrated in the very black sand everyone cursed. To find it, he did not need to be a hunter. He needed to be a farmer. He needed a way to harvest it, not a way to stumble upon it. He stood up, a new and dangerous purpose hardening his features. He would not dig for gold anymore. He would process the waste. He would mine the tailings piles of other, blinder men. From that day forward, Gideon became an outcast. The other prospectors in the canyon, men he had once shared a fire with, now watched him with a mixture of pity and contempt. He no longer worked the riverbanks. He did not own a pick or a shovel. His only tools were a pair of canvas buckets and a mule. He spent his days in silence, methodically hauling dirt from the tailings piles of abandoned claims. He would walk for miles to the site of some forgotten operation, a place picked clean of its obvious wealth, and fill his buckets with the dark, heavy sand left behind. He was a scavenger, a gleaner of fields already harvested. The others saw it as a profound madness, a symptom of the gold fever that had finally broken his mind. "There's poor Gideon," they would say, shaking their heads. "Picking through another man's garbage. The rivers made a ghost of him." He heard their whispers, saw their mocking glances, but he paid them no mind. He was no longer part of their world. He was consumed by a singular focus, solving the problem of separation. His camp became a laboratory. He took the black sand concentrates and experimented endlessly. He tried panning with a slower, gentler motion. He tried washing it over different surfaces, stretched canvas, rough-hewn wood, smooth stone. Each time, he could see the tiny specks of gold, but the process was agonizingly slow and inefficient. He was still losing too much of it. He needed to understand the enemy. He needed to understand the physics. He began a quiet journey of observation. He visited other camps, not to prospect, but to watch. He stood for hours, silently observing the different designs of rocker boxes and long toms. He noted the angle of the sluices, the spacing of the riffles, the volume and speed of the water men used. It was always the same. The systems were all designed with a brute force philosophy. Wash as much dirt as possible, as quickly as possible, to catch the bigger pieces. Speed and volume were paramount. Precision was an afterthought. The entire methodology was flawed at its foundation. His research led him to the camp's blacksmith, a man named Oren. Oren was a craftsman, a man who understood the fundamental properties of metal. He was not a prospector, but he shod their mules and repaired their tools. He dealt in the physical realities of weight, density, and heat. Gideon brought him 2 small pouches. One contained black sand, the other the tiny amount of gold dust he had painstakingly separated. "Tell me about these," Gideon said, his voice raspy from disuse. Oren, the catalyst in Gideon's quiet revolution, emptied the pouches onto his anvil. He nudged the 2 piles with a thick finger. "Well," he began, his voice a low rumble. "This here is mostly iron. Magnetite. It's heavy stuff. Denser than most rock." He then turned his attention to the gold. "But this is different. Gold is one of the heaviest things there is, heavier than lead, heavier than iron. If you had a bucket of this dust and a bucket of that black sand, the gold would weigh nearly 3 times as much." Gideon stared at the 2 piles. 3 times the weight. The difference was immense. Yet, when the particles were so small, suspended in the violent, churning water of a sluice box, that difference was negated. The water's force treated them almost equally, washing both away. The solution was not more water or more aggressive shaking. The solution had to be gentler. It had to be a process that allowed the profound difference in density to express itself. He spent the next weeks thinking about other forms of separation. He watched a woman in the camp winnowing grain, using the wind to lift the light chaff away from the heavy kernels. The principle was the same, a moving medium separating materials by weight. But wind was too unpredictable for his purposes. He needed something controllable. He thought of forges, of how slag separated from molten metal. He thought of how dust settled in a still room, the heaviest particles landing first. The idea came to him not in a flash, but as a slow, dawning realization. He could not fight the water. He had to tame it. He needed to create a system that used a minimal, perfectly controlled flow of water, not as a force to wash, but as a medium to lubricate. The separation itself would come from another force, something rhythmic and gentle. Vibration. A constant, gentle shaking that would cause the materials to stratify by density. The heaviest particles, the gold, would sink to the bottom. The lighter particles, the black sand, would stay on top, ready to be washed away by a placid sheet of water. He envisioned a machine, a long, wide table set at a precise, shallow angle. Its surface would not be smooth wood, which would let the fine gold slide away. It needed texture. It needed something to grip the microscopic particles of gold as they settled. A woolen blanket. The fine fibers would act as 1,000 tiny riffles, trapping the sinking gold while the sand grains tumbled over the top. It would be a slow, methodical machine, the complete opposite of the violent contraptions used by every other prospector. With the plan clear in his mind, Gideon returned to civilization. He took the small vial of gold dust he had accumulated, his seed capital, and walked to the supply depot. The clerk looked at him with surprise. Most men came to buy picks, shovels, beans, and bacon. Gideon's shopping list was bizarre. He asked for the finest, smoothest cedar planks they had. He requested a thick, woven wool blanket, the kind used for winter bedding. He bought sheets of tin, a handful of specially sized bolts, and a small, heavy cast-iron flywheel. Finally, he purchased a small, earthenware flask of mercury from the assayer's corner, a substance used to amalgamate the finest gold, but one he planned to use with a care and precision others lacked. The clerk wrote down the order, shaking his head. Gideon was a man buying the components for a piece of furniture, not a mining operation. He was either a genius or a complete fool, and everyone in the camp was certain they knew which. Gideon moved his camp. He found a secluded, level clearing on a high bluff overlooking the river, far from the prying, judgmental eyes of the other miners. He needed solitude to work, to turn the vision in his mind into a physical reality. His only companion in this endeavor was a boy named Finn, a young orphan who survived on the fringes of the mining camp by running errands and doing odd jobs. Finn was drawn to Gideon's quiet intensity and the strange project taking shape, and soon attached himself to the man, becoming a silent, watchful apprentice. The labor was methodical and painstaking. Gideon was not a rough carpenter. He worked like a cabinet maker. He planed the cedar boards by hand until they were perfectly flat and smooth, their surfaces like polished stone. He built a long rectangular frame, reinforcing the corners with hand-cut mortise and tenon joints. This would be the bed of his machine, the heart of the entire operation. Every measurement was precise, every joint tight and square. He was not just building a tool, he was crafting an instrument. The technical brilliance of the device was in its details. He constructed a heavy wooden chassis to hold the table, with a simple but effective suspension system made of leather straps. This would allow the table to move freely. At one end, he mounted the cast-iron flywheel he had purchased, connecting it with a wooden arm to the table itself. A hand crank would turn the flywheel, and its offset weight would translate the circular motion into a steady, rhythmic, side-to-side shake. The speed and amplitude of the vibration could be minutely adjusted by changing the linkage point. He built a hopper at the head of the table, a simple wooden funnel to hold the black sand concentrate. Below it, he fashioned a small trough from the tin sheets. A canvas hose would feed water from a barrel into this trough, which had a series of tiny, evenly spaced holes drilled in its bottom. This would not produce a torrent of water like a traditional sluice, but a gentle, uniform curtain of droplets, a film of water that would creep across the table's surface. The final, crucial element was the surface itself. Gideon carefully stretched the heavy woolen blanket over the table's surface, securing it with wooden battens along the edges. It had to be perfectly taut, without any ripples or sags. This textured surface was the key. The fine wool fibers would act as a passive trap, a sieve for density. They would hold the impossibly heavy particles of gold that settled to the bottom, while allowing the lighter grains of sand to be carried away by the gentle flow of water and the persistent vibration. He called it the separation table. It was during the final stages of construction that his past returned. Ezra, his former partner, had come back to the river, his dreams of a big strike on the Yuba having turned to dust. He was working a marginal claim downstream, barely making enough to eat. He and a few other miners came upon Gideon's secluded camp one afternoon. They stared at the strange contraption, this piece of oversized furniture sitting in the middle of the wilderness. Their confusion quickly turned to ridicule. "What in God's name is that, Gideon?" Ezra asked, a cruel smirk on his face. "Building a billiard table, are you? Planning to entertain the squirrels?" The other men laughed. They circled the machine, pointing at the flywheel, the blanket, the delicate water trough. It looked absurd, a madman's folly. "Gideon's shaken table," one of them jeered, and the name stuck. It became a running joke in the main camp. Men would ask each other if they'd heard about Gideon's folly, the machine for washing dirt that had already been washed. Ezra was the most relentless. "You've lost your senses," he said to Gideon, his voice laced with a bitter sort of pity. "You're trying to catch ghosts. A man needs a nugget, Gideon, something he can hold in his hand. You'll starve to death chasing this dust." Gideon did not answer them. He did not defend his work or try to explain the principles he had so carefully researched. He simply turned his back on their mockery and continued his work, his face a mask of quiet, determined focus. He tightened a bolt on the flywheel mechanism. He ran his hand over the surface of the wool blanket, checking the tension. Their words were meaningless noise. The only truth that mattered would be revealed by the machine itself. Finn, who had hidden behind a tree during the confrontation, watched with wide eyes. He saw the certainty in Gideon's posture, the unwavering confidence in his hands, and his boyish faith in the strange man and his even stranger machine deepened into a profound loyalty. The genius of the separation table was hidden in plain sight. The mockers saw a blanket and a crank, but they did not see the meticulous engineering that made it work. They didn't understand that the precise, shallow 1-degree angle of the table was the result of weeks of calculation, a perfect balance that allowed water to flow without creating a current strong enough to lift the fine gold. They didn't appreciate that the specific rhythm of the side-to-side shake was tuned to match the settling velocity of gold in water, a harmonic frequency that encouraged stratification. They saw a simple wool blanket, but they didn't comprehend its complex, fibrous topology. Under a magnifying glass, the surface was a forest of tiny hooks and barbs, an intricate landscape perfectly designed to ensnare any particle dense enough to sink through the vibrating slurry of sand and water. The entire device was a physical equation, with each component a carefully chosen variable. Gideon wasn't just washing dirt, he was exploiting the fundamental laws of physics with a subtlety and elegance that was completely alien to the brute force world of gold mining. He was ready to prove it. Gideon finished his work as the first cold winds of autumn began to sweep down from the high peaks of the Sierra Nevada. A sense of urgency had settled over the gold fields. The easy summer prospecting was over, the river level was dropping, and the remaining claims were yielding less and less. Men who had been flush with optimism in the spring were now facing the prospect of a long, hungry winter with little to show for their labor. The mood in the camps was turning grim, a desperation that made the mockery directed at Gideon seem sharper, more bitter. For his first test, Gideon chose his material carefully. He and Finn hauled a dozen buckets of black sand concentrate from the tailings pile of the claim he had once shared with Ezra. It was a poetic choice. He would draw his first success from the site of his greatest failure. He filled the hopper, then instructed Finn to begin turning the crank for the flywheel. The table came to life, beginning its slow, rhythmic, side-to-side dance. Gideon opened the valve from the water barrel. The gentle curtain of water descended, spreading across the wool blanket in a thin, shimmering sheet. Then he opened the hopper. A stream of black sand began to pour onto the head of the table. The effect was immediate and mesmerizing. The water and vibration formed a slurry that began to creep slowly down the incline. The magic was happening within that dark, flowing mixture. For hours, they worked in silence, a two-person factory. Finn turned the crank, his young muscles straining to maintain the steady rhythm. Gideon fed the hopper and controlled the flow of water, his eyes fixed on the surface of the table, watching the process with an almost religious intensity. The black sand flowed steadily down the length of the table and off the end, collected in a separate pile. The blanket, wet and dark, appeared unchanged. To an outside observer, it would have looked like a pointless exercise. As dusk fell, they stopped. The last of the sand had been washed. Gideon closed the water valve, and Finn stopped cranking. The table fell silent. This was the moment of truth. With a surgeon's care, Gideon began to release the battens that held the blanket in place. He and Finn lifted the heavy, waterlogged wool from the table and carried it to a large, clean basin. They submerged a corner of the blanket and began to wash it gently, rinsing the trapped material into the basin. Dark, heavy sediment clouded the water. When the entire blanket was clean, Gideon tipped the basin, carefully pouring off the water. He swirled the remaining sediment, letting the lighter particles wash over the edge. Slowly, a new substance was revealed at the bottom. It was not black. It was not sand. It was a thick, heavy, brilliant yellow paste, a dense concentrate of pure, fine gold. Finn gasped. Gideon stared, his heart pounding against his ribs. It was more than he had dared to hope for. In one afternoon, processing discarded waste, they had recovered more gold than he and Ezra had found in a month of back-breaking labor on the main river. It was a thick, lustrous smear of wealth that represented not luck, but vindication. The system worked. A few days later, Gideon walked into the supply depot. He did not offer a sack of nuggets or coarse flakes, the usual currency of the gold fields. Instead, he placed a small, heavy leather pouch on the counter. The clerk, a man named Miller, picked it up, and his eyebrows shot up in surprise at its unexpected weight. He loosened the drawstring and poured a small amount into a measuring scale. It was not dust. It was a fine, granular powder, as yellow and pure as the sun. Miller looked at Gideon with a new respect. It was a small amount of gold, but its quality and density spoke of a sophisticated recovery process. Ezra was in the depot that day, trying to trade a few miserable-looking flakes for a bag of flour. He saw the transaction. He saw the weight of the pouch in Gideon's hand and the clean, bright color of the gold on the scale. He was not convinced, but he was bewildered. He could not reconcile the image of Gideon's foolish machine with the tangible proof of wealth on the counter. He chose to believe it was a fluke. "Looks like your scavenging paid off for once, Gideon," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Must have stumbled on a lucky pocket in someone's leavings." Gideon simply nodded, paid for his supplies, and left. The community saw his small success not as the result of a revolutionary process, but as a stroke of dumb luck, an anomaly that changed nothing. They remained secure in their conventional wisdom, blind to the quiet industrial revolution that was about to take place. Winter arrived not as a gentle dusting of snow, but as a meteorological cataclysm. An unusually warm storm system, a Pineapple Express as it would later be known, slammed into the Sierra Nevada. It was not snow that fell, but a torrential, unrelenting rain, and it fell on a mountain range already burdened with a deep and heavy snowpack from earlier in the season. The result was a catastrophe of biblical proportions. The warm rain melted the snowpack with astonishing speed. Creeks and streams that were normally placid tributaries became raging muddy torrents. The American River, the lifeblood of the entire region, began to swell. It rose not by inches, but by feet every hour. The men in the river-level encampments watched with growing alarm, moving their tents to higher ground, thinking it was a temporary surge. They were wrong. This was not a seasonal flood. It was a complete reshaping of the landscape. The superstorm lasted for 3 days. On the second night, a wall of water, a churning slurry of mud, uprooted trees and debris roared down the canyon. It hit the mining camps with the force of a battering ram. It obliterated everything in its path. Long toms and rocker boxes, the heavy machinery of the gold rush, were swept away like children's toys. Tents, cabins, tools, and supplies vanished into the brown, chaotic water. The carefully excavated claims, the product of a year of human labor, were instantly erased, buried under a dozen feet of silt and gravel. The entire physical and economic infrastructure of the goldfields was destroyed in a single night. Gideon and Finn were safe. Their camp, built on the high bluff, was well above the reach of the floodwaters. They could only watch the destruction below, the roar of the river, a constant, terrifying thunder that shook the very ground they stood on. The water was a churning mass of brown chaos, a liquid monster consuming the world they knew. They saw entire trees, their roots ripped from the earth, cartwheel past in the current. It was a display of nature's raw, indifferent power. When the storm finally broke and the waters began to recede, the scale of the devastation was revealed. The canyon was unrecognizable. The familiar bars and banks were gone, replaced by a vast, uniform landscape of mud and fresh gravel. The men who survived were destitute. They had nothing left but the clothes on their backs. Among the most desperate was Ezra. His camp and those of his companions had been directly in the flood's path. They had barely escaped with their lives, scrambling up the canyon walls in the dark as the water rose around them. For 2 days, Ezra and a small group of survivors huddled in a makeshift shelter, cold, starving, and in a state of profound shock. Their world had been washed away. On the 3rd day, driven by hunger, they stumbled up the canyon, seeking higher ground and any sign of help. They found Gideon's camp. It was an island of order in a world of chaos. A sturdy tent, a neat stack of firewood, and the smell of cooking food. Gideon saw them approach, their faces gaunt, their bodies shivering. Without a word, he brought them to his fire and gave them food and blankets. He did not speak of their past mockery. He simply offered shelter to men in need. It was only after they had eaten and warmed themselves that Ezra truly looked around. He saw Gideon's strange table, sitting unharmed. He saw the neat piles of black sand waiting to be processed. He saw the well-stocked larder, all paid for with the steady income from that ridiculous machine. And then he looked down at the transformed canyon. The flood, in its terrible power, had done something extraordinary. It had acted as a colossal natural sluice box. It had scoured the gold from 100 miles of mountains and riverbeds. It had ground down rock, liberated ancient deposits, and sorted the entire contents of the river by weight and density. As the waters receded, they had left behind vast, sweeping deposits on the newly formed banks. And these deposits were not brown gravel or yellow sand. As far as the eye could see, the riverbanks were coated in a thick, uniform layer of one thing: black sand. To every other prospector, this was the final, cruel joke. Their equipment was gone, and the river was now choked with the very substance they had always considered worthless, a frustrating barrier to the gold. It was a landscape of pure, unadulterated ruin. But Gideon saw it differently. He walked with Ezra to the edge of the bluff and pointed down. "You see ruin," Gideon said, his voice quiet but firm. "I see a harvest. The river has done the work for us. It has brought the Motherlode to our doorstep." Ezra stared, uncomprehending. Gideon walked back to his table. He scooped a single bucket of the fresh black sand from the riverbank. He fed it into his machine, with Ezra and the other survivors watching in stunned silence. He worked with his usual calm precision. When he was done, he washed the blanket. In the bottom of the basin, a thick, breathtakingly large smear of pure gold settled. It was more than any of them had ever seen in one place. The Vindication was absolute, undeniable, and utterly silent. Gideon's folly was the only viable tool left in a world that had been remade. The silence that followed the demonstration was heavy with the weight of shattered pride and dawning realization. Ezra, a man broken by the flood and now humbled by Gideon's quiet genius, was the first to speak. His voice was a hoarse whisper. "Can you teach us?" he asked, not looking at Gideon, but at the astonishing quantity of gold in the basin. "Can you show us how to build one?" It was not just a request for help. It was a concession, a complete surrender of the old ways of thinking. Gideon looked at the desperate faces of the men around him. He saw not the mockers who had ridiculed his work, but survivors who needed a new way to live. "Yes," he said simply, "I will show you." There was no hesitation, no demand for payment or a share of their future earnings. His obsession had never been about personal wealth. It had been about solving a problem, about finding a better way. The knowledge, he believed, belonged to anyone who needed it. Over the next few weeks, Gideon's camp transformed into a school and a workshop. He patiently explained the principles of his machine. He taught them about specific gravity, about harmonic vibration, about the crucial role of the textured surface and the gentle flow of water. He drew diagrams in the dirt, showing them how to construct the frame, how to build the crank mechanism, how to stretch the blanket for optimal tension. He held nothing back. Soon, the quiet canyon began to echo with the sounds of saws and hammers. Using salvaged wood and scavenged parts, the miners began to build their own versions of the separation table. They were cruder than Gideon's original, but they were functional. The rhythmic, creaking sound of the shaken tables became the new heartbeat of the camp. The entire economy of the region shifted. the frantic, individualistic hunt for nuggets was replaced by a more industrial, collaborative effort. Men formed teams to haul the endless supply of black sand and process it through the tables. The camp, which had been on the brink of starvation, began to prosper. It was a quieter, more stable prosperity, built not on luck, but on engineering and methodical labor. One day, a man named Silas, a traveling carpenter and self-taught engineer, passed through the canyon. He was on his way to a new settlement further north, but he was stopped in his tracks by the strange sight. A whole community of men operating these odd, shaking machines. He, the disseminator of the idea, was fascinated. He sought out the source and was directed to Gideon. Silas spent a week with him, not just learning how to build the table, but questioning Gideon about the underlying principles. He was a man who understood mechanics, and he recognized the subtle genius in Gideon's design. He filled a notebook with detailed sketches, precise measurements, and copious notes on the theory of its operation. When Silas left, he carried with him more than just a new skill. He carried the blueprint for the future of mining. A few months later, in San Francisco, he published a small pamphlet. It was a practical guide, complete with diagrams and instructions on how to build this revolutionary device. He did not do it for fame, but because he believed it was useful knowledge that should be shared. In the pamphlet, seeking a marketable name, he called the invention the California Shaker Table. He made no mention of the quiet, obsessive prospector in the remote canyon who had conceived it. The idea spread like wildfire. The pamphlets were printed and reprinted. Shaker tables in 100 different variations began to appear in goldfields all across the American West. They were adapted, improved, and scaled up. The core principles Gideon had discovered became foundational to modern placer mining. The name Gideon, however, was lost to history. The invention became anonymous, a piece of common knowledge whose specific origin was forgotten, absorbed into the collective wisdom of the industry. 20 years passed. The raw, chaotic mining camp in the canyon had grown into a proper town, with a church, a school, and a post office. The landscape was now dominated by the scars of industrial mining. Hydraulic cannons blasted away whole hillsides, and steam-powered stamp mills crushed quartz ore to a fine powder. But at the heart of all these massive operations was the same fundamental principle Gideon had pioneered: the efficient, mechanical separation of fine gold from worthless rock using water and vibration. The shaker table, now built of steel and powered by steam, was a ubiquitous piece of machinery. Gideon still lived there. He was an old man now, his hair white, his hands gnarled with age. He had never grown rich. He lived in a small, comfortable cabin on the same bluff where he had built his first table. He had made a decent living, but he had never had the ruthless ambition to build an empire from his invention. He was known and respected in the town as one of the original pioneers, a quiet old man who had been there from the beginning. No one, not even the town historian, knew that the entire prosperity of their community was built upon the foundation of his singular vision. When Gideon died, the town council paid for his funeral. He was buried in the small cemetery overlooking the river. His gravestone was simple, carved from local granite. It read, Gideon, Pioneer, Prospector. There was no mention of his true legacy, no epitaph for the man who had single-handedly changed the course of mining. He was remembered as just another old-timer, one of the thousands who had come seeking their fortune. The impact of his forgotten innovation, however, was immeasurable. The shaker table, in its countless forms, extracted billions of dollars in gold from the earth. It funded the growth of cities, financed railroads, and fed generations of families. It became a standard tool in mines from Colorado to Australia, from the Klondike to South Africa. The knowledge he had given away freely became common sense, a technique so fundamental that no one ever thought to ask where it came from. Later, geologists and historians would find the remains of old, rotted wooden tables in remote canyons and puzzle over their design, seeing them as a curious, anonymous step in the evolution of mining technology. His legacy was not a name carved in stone or a story told in books. It was quieter, more pervasive. It was in the steady, rhythmic shake of machines in 1,000 mines. It was in the small, anonymous pouches of fine gold dust that, when gathered together, built nations and shaped the course of history. It was a vast, silent fortune, born of a single man's refusal to accept conventional wisdom, a treasure he had found hidden not in the brilliant gleam of a nugget, but within the deep, dark heart of the worthless black sand.